I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast. I'm Aaron Bergstrom, and I'm here with my brothers,
Anders
and Anton.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And this month we're heading on to the British mainland for a review of Danny Boyle's 28 Years Later. We'll dig into this new zombie survival horror film before briefly discussing the previous films in the series, 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later. Before we jump into the review, if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a 5-star rating or review. We're an independent podcast without major sponsors or marketing, so reviews and ratings are the number one way to get the word out and support the show. Thank you for listening, and now, onto the show.
And here we go.
In 2002, director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland released a low-budget apocalyptic horror film that accidentally reinvigorated the zombie genre. 28 Days Later followed a small group of people, led by Cillian Murphy's Jim, trying to survive in a London decimated by the rage virus, which turned humans into fast, rabid monsters that acted a whole lot like zombies. 28 Years Later catches up to the aftermath of this world, you guessed it, 28 years later. Aaron Taylor-Johnson and Alfie Williams played Jamie and Spike, a father and son living on a small island connected to the British mainland. The British Isles are quarantined from the rest of the world to prevent the spread of the rage virus, so Jamie and Spike live isolated lives free of the internet, electricity, and most technological innovations. We catch up to Jamie and Spike as they head onto the mainland for Spike's initiation to the rites and rituals of hunting and surviving in this new, post-apocalyptic world. When 28 Days Later first came out, the fast zombie was a novelty. But in the decades since the film's release, we've experienced peak zombie media with fast zombies and plenty of other variations across movies, TV shows, comic books, and video games. Most notably were TV shows such as The Walking Dead and The Last of Us, which took direct cues from 28 Days Later in crafting their post-apocalyptic worlds overrun by zombies. So in crafting 28 Years Later, simply approaching a zombie story similar to 28 Days Later was not an option without seeming passé. So Boyle and Garland decided to mix things up with a new, dense mythology about mainland Britain, the infected, and the world left in the aftermath of the rage virus. It's a zombie film, but also a folk horror film, and a treatise on Britain's haunted past. With all its bold innovations, it's possible 28 Years Later reinvigorates the zombie genre like the original film did, but it might take another 28 years to learn its true impact.
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
So guys, right off the top, I've heard a little bit about your thoughts on it, but not really the full picture, so just right off the bat, what did you think about 28 Years Later as a movie? Anders?
I generally liked it quite a bit. I think that it's bold and interesting, which I really appreciated because it's so easy with a legacy sequel to play things safe, to just retread the same thing over and over again. And I like some of the directions that Boyle and Garland go with this one. That said, it's a little bit shaggy at times, and I'm not really sure where it's going with the rest of the series. And there's a couple of times where it leans into sort of certain survival horror tropes that I don't love. Maybe get into later. But so I liked it quite a bit, maybe not as much as the first one, but it was an enjoyable watch, and I love how insanely gory and violent it is, because I think sometimes movies, they talk up like their shock value and stuff like that, but this one like really goes all out, which I appreciated.
Yeah, it's an exceptionally gory movie. More so, I'd say, in the original, which is, I think 28 Days Later is just a lot of, like, vomiting blood, which is pretty upsetting to watch anyway. Mm-hmm. But this one is, like,
you're
heads
having
being
people's
ripped
heads
off,
ripped out with their spines attached, yeah.
people being killed by disembodied heads, lots of stuff. Anton, what did you think?
I thought it was great. I think there's parts of it that rival or surpass anything in the first movie. I also think it's maybe the best legacy sequel I've seen since, like, I don't know, Top Gun Maverick, in the sense of I think it's getting at what made the first one great, but then taking it to a different level. It's not just here to just repeat in a stale way. It's not here to do trite fan service. It's really to be like, okay, where else could we take this story world? And so obviously the premise of 28 years later, it's there in the title. but it feels like Garland and Boyle have really leaned into thinking about, like, okay, what would that look like? And I agree that it inhabits a lot of the tropes of post-apocalyptic fiction, anywhere from The Road, on the darker side, to even aspects of Mad Max with the Jimmy gang at the end of the movie. But I also really like its folk horror aspect, Aaron, which you mentioned. In my review of 28 Days Later, I mentioned that upon rewatching that movie, it reminded me a bit of The Wicker Man, which is, one of the greatest works of British horror film, and a great work of folk horror. And I think this movie, the connections to aspects of The Wicker Man are even stronger. And what I mean by folk horror isn't just like, The Wicker Man has folk music, but it's about going deeper into the sense of, like, what is folk? Like, roots, traditions, what makes a people. And this movie is exploring the people's relationship to the land as well, and the land, and what is this movie saying about, like, the English? That intrigues me, as well as sort of the developing the anthropology of the infected. So I think there's a lot going on in it. Maybe something I'll just throw at you guys is, what do you think in terms of, one thing I find about Danny Boyle is that his movies always start better than the end. And even as much as I admire this movie, it seems to work in that direction as well. Maybe only Slumdog Millionaire sort of seals the deal. But, like, even Trainspotting, the opening is brilliant. I love the whole movie, but he always sort of has this brilliance, and then they sort of, I don't know.
I think I think T2 Trainspotting is, the ending's better than the beginning.
Okay, I haven't seen that yet.
I think that's one of the best legacy sequels.
It's true.
I also think it's an Alex Garland thing, who he tends to revert to convention in the endings of things.
In the third act.
And I think it's, his third act, it's you get it in Sunshine, you get it in Ex Machina. I think the only movie of his that really, really lands 100% through is Annihilation, because he's drawing on such strong, weird source material. And I think the ending of that movie is, like, haunting. Like, the encounter with the alien in it is incredible. And this movie has a bit of Sunshine and 28 Days Later and Ex Machina and stuff, in that, like, the ending seems a little too neat for what was coming before, and how intriguing, and Civil War even, and what was coming before, right? Something that you mentioned, Anton, I feel like we should just tackle it right away, because I might have a different thought here, but you mentioned legacy sequel.
Yep.
I don't know if this movie qualifies currently, because it doesn't have really any connection to the previous ones in terms of inter-story lore. I know Cillian Murphy's going to show up in the next one. We already know that from the casting.
I was expecting him in this one at some point, but yeah.
No, but he doesn't. It's cool that he doesn't show up yet, and that they don't force the issue. Yeah. But, like, this movie doesn't seem actually self-reflexive to 28 Days Later in the way that a T2 Trainspotting, or a Blade Runner 2049, or The Force Awakens, or Scream 5, etc. So I'm really hesitant in calling it a legacy sequel, even though it fits in that kind of 23 years later movie coming out, a sequel that's really delayed, right?
In some ways, you don't really even need to have seen 28 Days Later to get this movie. It kind of stands on its own, and in some ways takes it off in new and intriguing directions. That,
in a way that Road Warrior and Mad Max. You don't need to see Mad Max to watch Road Warrior, but it deepens it. And I feel like this movie has a bit of Furiosa in it, too, in terms of the wild world building, the mythology, the almost mythic elements that come into it. But we can get into it. Anton, what are your thoughts on the legacy sequel thing?
I think you're right in that it doesn't exhibit the dominant features of what we describe as the legacy sequel or the requel, these sort of late extensions of a franchise, which are inherently self-reflexive. That's the most key feature of everything from Jurassic World to The Force Awakens, even Top Gun Maverick. But I'm using that word in its most basic sense, right? It's a 23 years later sequel. This is something that Hollywood is doing. The only way this movie got made is because the legacy sequel is a feature of how Hollywood works, and they want to revive and kickstart IP that they still have their hands on. I think the legacy sequel aspect is part of its context of production and what it is, but I think you're right in that, it's not similar to a lot of these ones. Maybe, on a more precise level, maybe it's just a late sequel, because it's less concerned with legacy. We'll see where the sequel and, if they finish off the trilogy, where that goes and whether there is more reflection backwards on the legacy of what came before. I think you're also right about the fact that you could probably watch this movie and have almost zero confusion without having seen the prior films. And I also thought it was interesting that 28 weeks later, the one not written by Garland and not directed by Boyle, which, I think they had some small input on that movie, but they sort of pushed that one aside, like in the opening title credits. Because if you remember, my wife reminded me, she's like, "Oh, so are the infected on the continent in France because of the that there's a little sort of like ending where it's like tagged on to 28 weeks later," and I was like, "Oh no, that's sort of just brushed off in the opening titles where it's like the infected had pushed to the continent or pushed back and now it's contained." Kind of remind me a bit of the back and forth between JJ and
Ryan Johnson.
Ryan Johnson.
I think it's partially that Danny Boyle and Alex Garland are so fixated on the rage virus as some kind of metaphor for the pent-up poison of British Empire. It's this like contained within the prim and proper, and then it's unleashing that true like poison within, right? And so he needs it to be contained to Britain because it doesn't work as like an exploration of what Britain is and its like roots if it's beyond.
This is the other thing I liked about one of the other things I liked about the movie is that, Anton, and on one sense you said that it kind of fleshes out and explores the idea, like, what if this virus, was, where would that go 28 years later and stuff like that. But in some ways, I'm like, the movie is not really interested in like a sort of serious, like logical, exploration. Because in some ways, like, why are there still people living on the mainland and things like, if in real life, I could imagine like they'd just nuke England if it was actually that dangerous, or they would have like somehow like gotten all the people out, or you know what I mean. I find, because it's not really interested in the plausibility, it's interested in the ideas, it's interested in expanding the mythology, right?
It's a premise for speculation.
And it's going almost in, yeah, exactly. It's almost going into mythical like kind of world, which I kind of like about it.
It's like Area X and Annihilation.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of real world analog, just think of the zone of occlusion in Chernobyl. People still live there.
Yeah.
And it's very strange. These people didn't leave, even though there's like really the most intense radiation in the world, right? But you have these weird communities of this place where nature took it back.
It is very Alex Garland. You know what I mean? Like, in the same way that Alex Garland's not interested in civil war, we talked about that last year. Like, he's not really interested in like how did this war start, or like what are the politics and who's the Democrats and all this kind of stuff. In the same way, here, you make gestures at real world stuff. He's interested in like something deeper, something like more primal, and something more mythic in that sense. And I actually appreciate that, because I think it's too easy for these kind of survival apocalyptic things to get bogged down in that. And so I think the Mad Max comparison is a good one.
That's true in the sense of, like, if we compare it to 28 Weeks Later, which was, one of its defining features is trying to be a little bit more realistic about how would this play out, what would NATO's role be in trying to sort of deal with the infected. And clearly Garland and Boyle are being like, okay, we're not interested in sort of the real world politics of this, but they're taking it as an opportunity to explore a post-apocalyptic Britain that has this sort of latent rage in these wild people, and then also sort of the question of what is sort of the English civilization, and what's its relationship to that wild people and the latent rage, and how would you sort of build that civilization? Where would it go? Can
you unpack that a little bit more? Because I am very interested. This is the part of the movie that's the most intriguing to me.
I haven't worked it all out, and I'm curious what you guys think. To me, one of, And this relates to, we could talk about why this is, to talk about the folk sort of aspect and its questions of Britishness. It also relates to some of Danny Boyle's interesting stylistic features, which really gripped me early on, such as the use of the Kipling poem, Boots, this old recording from 1915 that he uses.
We're foot, slog, 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 slogging over Africa. Foot, 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 slogging over Africa. Boots, 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 moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war.
And this is sort of like intercut into the early exploring of the mainland and things like this. And then we get these images, right, of Olivier's Henry V, the English longbow, all these sorts of things recurring. I think it's hard for me, like, after one viewing to totally unpack. There isn't a clear, this isn't an allegory in a simplistic level. There might be allegorical features, but it's not, a simplistic allegory. But I'm trying to work out what this means. And it does seem to be tapping into a lot of sort of also the folklore of the British Isles.
Yeah, so for me, that's the part I'm a huge fan of The Wicker Man. I'll just throw that out there. But I think the other thing, like this, some of it has to do with how they build on the infected and start to giving the infected sort of these different features and different characteristics, right? So you now have them kind of developing into, the slow crawlers, right? You have the regular rage infected, and you have the alphas, right? Who kind of evoke these sort of like primordial giants almost, right, in the land. And so there's something for me there about like that. And they're also kind of giving them more like kind of like agency. It's almost like there's some suggestions in the film, without getting into too many spoilers, but like that possibly the infected might even have some of their own sort of culture and things like that, right? And so to me, the infected kind of evoke the Saxon and pre-Norman inhabitants of Britain, in a sense. That's sort of something that is sort of like repressed under the later waves of immigration, right? Because I've read a lot of, in the last couple of years, gotten really into reading some of that, like Arthurian stuff. I also just recently read this past winter The Eagle of the Ninth, which is about Roman Britain, and I think the way that book describes the sort of the Celtic tribes and things like that sometimes recalls kind of the horror that the Romans have at their savagery and sort of violence is sort of echoed in this. So I think that's kind of an interesting feature of this. And then when you take Boots with its like themes of like, British war making overseas and things like that, and it's interesting.
But Boots is also like Kipling wrote these, as many Kipling poems are. He writes it very much as a pro-imperial colonial thing, but there's a layer of meaning beyond it that seems to actually eat at its own like core and foundation. And so, Boots is this really regimental poem about the rhythm and order of a soldier marching, but it almost shows that you need this kind of artificial limitation upon the person to contain and civilize what is actually like barbaric and like violent. It's like the soldier is only a hero because there is this kind of rhythm that the boots and the uniform puts them into, and otherwise it is just a savage who's going out there to attack, and and that is what sets the British apart, so to speak. And it's actually insane how deep the levels, even like the decision of setting and filming this movie on Lindisfarne Island in Northumberland, which is this it's called Holy Island, like literally that's the name of it, and it's this important Celtic monastery that was sacked by the Vikings. And so again, it's this kind of citadel of civilization, of Christendom, of a proper Britishness that stands apart from the savagery, that the setting is working all this in there. And so there's this kind of constant tension between the civilized, the uncivilized, the British and the non-British, the land and the culture. And it plays across this idea of like the infected and the non-infected, because it's this civilizational differences that you start to get where, even if it doesn't play into this idea that the infected have a society, they have a animalistic pack nature, right? Like there's something there, and it's clear. Remember, like the infected are not zombies in the sense they're not dead.
Yeah.
They're alive. And so they have to eat, they have to sustain themselves. As we learn in this movie, they breed and things like that, and like kind of ridiculous little elements, which I think those are the kind of choices that are bold, and some people might not go with it, but it gives the film a very provocative texture where it's like forcing you to be like, wait, how does that happen? Well, we're going to tell you, keep watching these movies, and we're going to like dig into it more, and we're going to investigate what is the meaning of this. But it all comes back to this idea of Britain, right? And it's these characters, and you even take the rituals of Jamie and Spike, right? It's like he's going off to war, and they have the whole lodge. They're gonna have a party when you come home, Spike, and we're gonna like, you're going off and you're a man now, and then when you come back, we're all gonna get drunk and like tell the tales of. And there's the whole sequence where Jamie is talking about, oh, he's a giant killer. He shot the alpha down and stuff, and it's like, Dad, that didn't happen. You're making this up. He's like, no, maybe in your memory you weren't a hero, but everybody knows you're a hero. And it's the movie is just so skeptical about these certain hallmarks of like British culture, militarism, identity, but it's not merely a deconstruction. It's like a true investigation of it, right? Like of what the implications are, and it uses that to create this milieu that is very evocative because it feeds into this larger mythological world that it's creating.
I would agree that I think that the film is not a one-dimensional critique of British Empire or Britishness. And I think it's exploring the fact that Britain, the English, there's a tension within them that they became one of the great empires of the world, colonizing many, a quarter of the earth at its height, perhaps. But it's also an island just off the edge of kind of the mainland that itself has, its people are sort of built up of a series of invasions, conquests, and colonizations of that island, from the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Norman conquest, etc. Even you could think about the English sort of conquests, absorption of the Scottish into Great Britain, and so it's exploring this tension between that's sort of there within Britishness, right, as both colonized and colonizer. And it sets up, and it's also then exploring, right, civilized versus savage, these sorts of themes. But I like that the film's not, especially in this day and time, it's not a simplistic read of these things. Because what I would say is that there's an aspect of nobility and admirable qualities to what these English survivors have achieved on this island. But at the same time, it wants to show that there's darker undercurrents to that. So it's like, on the one hand, it seems like this island is like, oh, this is a very harmonious little island. This seems to be great. And then once they've had a celebration, everyone has to get drunk at the pub. And, we start to see,
what's more English than
one
that?
of the main heroes, commits adultery and begins, a breakdown of his family. And like, it's the film's interested in both sort of like some of the noble features of this. It's not just holding up, say, the Olivier eclipse as being like, this is sort of a false thing that needs to be smashed. There's something about like they're holding on to these things, and this is how they're going to sustain themselves and keep themselves going. But at the same time, like, this isn't like an idealized, totally harmonious. And there's this strange image that I don't know what to make of that I want to put to you guys. There's this masked girl who appears in the classroom or the main hall at various points. And I can't make up my mind whether she's a girl in a sort of a dunce cap kind of punishment with this mask on, or it's a phantom. Like, is she actually there, or what's going on with this?
You see that mask at a different point, though,
Grandpa
outside
wears
of
it.
exactly, and so it seems to be almost a cultural thing that we are never actually explained as some kind of role within this rituals that they undertake, right? Is it the role of the infected within this kind of ritual that they have?
That's the part of the movie that to me reminded me the most of like Wicker Man.
Yeah.
And it's actually the society that
the-
they've built on the island is the one that's actually like Summer Isle. like, right? In some weird way. Spike comes to doubt some of these, cultural roles, comes to doubt his father. And, he sort of plays the role of, like, Officer Hardy in, like, right, who's coming from the outside. And he has that strong moral center as well, Spike, right? He's the one who, whereas everyone else sees these things as, like, necessary parts of the ritual of surviving in this harsh world, right? So I think all that stuff's very interesting.
Well, there's a lot of features in this movie that are, like, hard to make sense of whether they're diegetically, like, real. So we've talked about the intercutting of, like, the poem, the intercutting of the images. Obviously, those are sort of montage effects. But then we also get these sort of red-tinted flashes of maybe what happened at nighttime previously. And then the question...
With the infected.
Yes, with the infected. And then the question is this like a premonition that Spike is seen of what had occurred there? Is this just for the viewer and is sort of non-diegetic? And then you even get into stuff that then is tapping into the folklore on an almost fairy tale level. Like, how is it that the alpha almost controls sort of these flock of crows or blackbirds and sends them out?
It's like Saruman.
Yeah, and like it's something magical, or like, or like, is this real? Is this like explained? And we get that gorgeous vision of like the sky when they're running across at night,
Milky Way,
back to the island.
Yeah, but like the infected are associated with the natural,
yeah,
and
the
so
wild man,
it's like
man.
they're human going back to the earth, right? And so they are able to attune with the animals in a way that a civilized person isn't. And so it's like maybe a human in the past could have made the crows do that, but now they can't. But the alpha can do that, and the alpha even is driven right by this basic primordial sense. You get the child that is born in the movie, and Alpha Samson is like out to find it. And there's this clear like implication that he's probably the father, but even if he's not, it's this idea of like, to him it's precious, the baby, and he needs the baby to continue whatever the infected are going on. And so that will probably continue into the next movies, because Samson's not killed at the end, the baby's not killed, things like that.
Stay really still. Go back to the trees. Move! Go! Move! 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 Just go!
I kind of want to just pull back here a second and focus on the characters, because I feel like the characters are also fulfilling these kind of classical roles in this sense, in terms, because we have this father and son, and we haven't actually mentioned yet the mother, right? Jodie Comer's Isla, and she is sick, and we don't know why she's sick, but she has these kind of bouts of almost dementia. She has nosebleeds, she has excruciating pain, and there's no doctors on the island from pre-times. There's healers, but there's not doctors, so nobody really knows how to diagnose what's wrong with her. And so Spike is really driven by his it's weird, it's like he's trained by Jamie to become a man, right? And there's this one of the earliest scenes is like, do you have your knife, son? It's like, yes, I have it. And then later, when he has a fracture with Jamie, when he sees him cheating, he pulls the knife on Jamie to defend his mom. And then Jamie kind of lets it be, gives him back the knife. And then when Spike leaves the scene, he like punches through the wall because he's like so angry. But it's almost like he's acknowledging that he's made a man in this. He's now made somebody who can defend against his own will.
Yep, you can push back.
Exactly, somebody who can push back against him. But then now it's Spike's duty. It's that kind of like the father trains the son to defend the mother against the father. It's like this very weird primal thing happening there. Even though Jamie doesn't mean Isla anything wrong, it's just he knows that she's ultimately a burden that he has no answer to.
Right. He's kind of broken in some ways because he knows that she's doomed in some way. And he's already letting go. He's not willing to fight for her the way that Spike is.
Yeah, but he's still a good dad in this. Like, he equips his son, trains him really well. He's very protective. He teaches him well. it's very impressive the way that he takes Spike out onto the island and like teaches him things, and he's not overly like, he's constantly praising them for being like, you doing a good job, and like he's not kind of like, oh, you weren't manly enough immediately. He's like, no, everybody's scared, you do this right, like we're working. So there's a lot to admire in Jamie, but he's still like held back by certain of these roles that he's forced to play within this society, right?
Well, that's why Jamie then we can identify with I think with this sort of question of like Britishness, the sort of paternalistic, and it has its necessary functions and value, but then it also seems to have its deficiencies.
Yeah. What did you guys think of the performances? Because like Aaron Taylor Johnson's a guy I've always kind of liked, but I also think he's not miscast, but like given roles that don't really let him play it more than just a handsome guy or just a cool guy.
Yeah, no, he's good in this. He's good.
I thought this was a good break from his usual as of late.
I feel like Nosferatu in this is really showing his like layers.
Yeah,
he's able to do stuff.
Yeah, he's a guy who's also well cast for like period settings, and then in this it's sort of a post-apocalyptic. He has the masculine ruggedness to like be in this sort of a role, as well as look very much like he can be, you know, in 19th century Germany. Like, not every actor who's like a handsome leading man right now can actually pull that off.
But I also appreciate that he's a guy like essentially my age, right? But he's playing a dad. But like the characters' ages are actually kind of realistic in a scenario like this. Like, yeah, they'd have kids in their like early 20s
because they've been on this island.
Yeah, he's not going to be a 45 dad.
Yeah,
he was born. Maybe he was younger than Spike when.
Yeah, he was like
happened,
really.
Right?
I don't think he really remembers the before.
Well, a little bit, yeah. He was if it was almost 30 years ago.
A little bit. He mentions the frisbee, but it's all like.
Yeah, he was probably like 5 or 6, you know, kind of thing. If he's in his mid-30s, yeah.
But what do you think of Alfie Williams as Spike? Because this is his feature debut.
I thought he was very, very strong performance. He's able to be the kind of child character that I like, that seems realistic, that isn't precocious, that doesn't seem stagey. And I think the other thing is that like sometimes child actors almost overperform and try to do too much emoting. And, you know, I have kids who are, you know, my boys are 8 now, and you're like, at times, like, there's a crypticness to children that, like, sometimes the child actor tries to sell too much of the emotion and what's going on in their head. And, like, sometimes, like, I thought his performance like really, really nailed it.
I was reminded of the fact that, so I find Spike very much a Danny Boyle character.
Yes.
Like, because it is where the sentimentality comes through, but not in a bad way, but just in a descriptive way. And he reminds me of the character from Millions.
Yeah.
Because he's almost a guy, he's forced into this scenario and he rises above it, but he's got an inherent decency at his core that kind of fuels him. And that sympathy for others, which can be his downfall as well. But it's like, he does rise to the occasion in moments. So child actors are very anxious, right? It's just a nature of, especially children nowadays, extremely anxious, but child actors often don't really know how to inhabit themselves on screen, so they often sublimate the anxiety into the character, and they use that to fuel whatever kind of insecurities or trauma or etc. that fuels the character's motivation, right? It's a classic thing. You take your own insecurities, you work it into the motivation, and then becomes like naturalized into the performance, right? So that it's no longer, we see the character as nervous, we don't see you as nervous, but he doesn't seem to have that, like in that he's a character that actually seems unsettled and uneasy in so many aspects of this world, but I never sense a uncertainty in the way that he's handling a scene, whether it's with other performances or with the gross stuff that's happening on screen, or simply this idea that like, okay, you have to be in the woods by yourself being the lead in this movie.
Yeah.
And like, you got to carry it for now like 30 minutes by yourself kind of thing. Yeah. And he doesn't seem overwhelmed by it, but he's still able to let the character's vulnerability come through in a way that doesn't seem like cheap or stuff outside of the performance creeping in. And so I was pretty impressed with him. And I thought like, he's very good with Aaron Taylor Johnson, but I think he's even better with Jodie Comer. The scenes of them, there's just a certain like protectiveness that he has towards her that seems really relatable. And it
also brings out
out
his inner self that he doesn't reveal to his father the same way.
So
he's able,
the childishness.
Yeah, his childishness. There's the whole conversation about, you know, does your dad act silly around you? Does he sort of goof
Yeah.
around? And there's moments where Jamie's tender with his son, but he's not goofy and he's not silly.
No.
And so those are nice humanistic touches that Boyle and Garland sort of put in there that I thought worked well. They're not overextended to sort of add too much. Like, I feel like in a lot of times you're trying to like, now we're going to reveal some character and it's sort of like, it plays us false. And I thought those moments worked well. I thought Jodie Comer was also really good. It's a hard role because...
It is a hard... That's what I was going to say. It's a hard role for her.
Well, she's written, like, the way it's written, she's kind of like a non-person, mom sick upstairs for like, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of the movie. And then we
Very
start to
classically
like, see
British
her more.
character.
And then she becomes a bit of a holy fool in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Right?
whole part
Where she's almost
she like...
prophetic.
And also the part where she like wakes up during the night and like kills the
slow-lo. Yeah.
What are they called again?
Slow-los.
Yeah, slow-los.
Slow
Oh,
and low.
so creepy. We got to talk about those two.
What, eating the worms? Yeah. Before we transition, I do want to talk about the world building about this kind of as a survival horror movie because I think it really follows the rules. We'll get into this, but before that, I just want to touch on Ralph Fiennes.
Yes.
Showing up and how the movie transitions very much into folk horror with his introduction. So, like, what do you guys think of Ralph Fiennes and this kind of lifelong quest of the character to create this memento mori, which is essentially a bone ossuary of all the people who've died, including the infected?
Yeah. I thought it was an interesting turn. I don't 100% know what to make of it. It's strange.
Is he good or bad, right?
Exactly. Because I have to admit, this is the one thing that rubs me the wrong way with some of the plot, is I dislike... There's a trope in here about suffering and, frankly, in euthanasia. That
Yeah,
I
the euthanasia
find-
thing.
I don't like that in movies, especially in a post-apocalyptic film. I find it...
It's in The Last of
like,
Us, too.
Wouldn't you hold on as much as you could
Yeah.
in this kind of situation?
But are we meant to accept it as right?
Exactly. That's the
Yeah.
question, right? To me, it really depends on what they do with it in later scenes. But it does give Dr. Kelson this kind of like, he's both like strangely compassionate and caring, but also kind of frightening at times too.
Yes.
Like, he's this strange like character covered in red iodine, and like you don't really know what to make of him. Like, he lives among the bones of the dead. It's like,
Well, and he seems to know the Alpha, but he never kills him, even though the Alpha tries to kill him.
yeah,
Or
he's
very
the one who named him Samson,
Yeah.
right?
Samson. Yeah.
So I would say that I think Dr. Kelson is the Kurtz of this film. And I said that to Anders after we saw our screening. And it's not that they're trying to make him an exact parallel. But
He's even
again,
bald.
this is a film that's interested in sort of empire, colonialism, and the idea that we're gonna
He's gone native.
We have to arrive at this mysterious figure sort of out there in the woods on the mainland. And then we get there and we get a bald-headed guy who's rambling about all sorts of strange things. Like, I couldn't help but think of Brando's Kurtz. That's at the same time, it takes it in a different direction. But his embrace, they both similarly have an embrace of death. If we think back to Kurtz is like, he's experienced the heart of darkness, and in that, it's like the savageness is just like sort of the brutality and sort of will imposed and death imposed that is the natural world, according to Conrad, and then also explored in Coppola's Apocalypse Now. His approach to death is different, but I also think then that comparison, if we think, is he the Kurtz figure, also invites us to not necessarily take everything he says as the position the film is necessarily inviting us to accept. So I would say that I'm also equally bothered when sometimes films sort of have a pro-euthanasia approach. But I would also say that it is a trope of the post-apocalyptic.
Yes,
and
that's
these
why
sorts
I
of
was
things,
saying it's
where
a
there's
trope,
always
yeah.
the question of like, it's there in the road. Would it be better to kill the boy at some point before anything happens? There's always the question of like, there's this tension because we recognize that the post-apocalyptic is based on this idea that survival at all costs is the supreme goal. And people take that to an extent where they're willing to brutalize other people. But then there's also the question in the recognition that, well, maybe in certain circumstances, under certain suffering, I don't actually want to survive. And those things are always sort of in tension. in the survival post-apocalyptic. And I don't think we necessarily have to say that Kelson has it right. And he seems to be so obsessed with preserving the death that, you know, in his emphasis on the memento mori, at one point he mentions, you know, the memento amoris, right? The, you know, remember like your love, but we don't get a sense that he's ever actually embraced that in his life, because he's never gone out to find other people. Seemed, even if he was sort of whimsical about maybe someone will come see this someday, like he's never taken those steps to actually reach out to other people. And he has a weird connection. You're right. The simple thing would be, why have you not killed Samson and eliminated this danger for all the humans who are still alive on the island? So Kelson's not the wise sage who we have to sort of be like, this is the Obi-Wan Kenobi figure, you know?
No, if anything, because if we're going to return to the British, if anything, he has a bit of the danger of Merlin and someone like that.
Yeah, and it's, you know, he claims that this ossuary he's put together is a memento mori, but, you know, as the title of the next movie coming that we're getting in 28 weeks, that's how they timed it, the release, called The Bone Temple, he's created a temple to death. It's not just a reminder of death. It's literally the whole purpose and worship of death. And it's funny, where he's like, people have to remember death, and it's like, this is an eradicated, emaciated world where infected will murder you at any moment. Death is omnipresent. These people don't forget death. It's just that you've forgotten the life aspect of it. You live among the bones because that's all that allows you the control of the environment. And so it's like he's calcified the past in this like monument to it and refuses to move beyond it, even though that allows him in certain respects to become more in touch with the natural world. It also means he's divorced from any sense of like humanity that is there, right? And so there's a lot of interesting things that are left hanging in Kelson and how what's going to come, because he's clearly going to show up again, and a lot of this is going to play out, and we're going to get what is, you know, is he somebody who's come across the Jimmies before and stuff, and these other world things. So maybe we'll leave Kelson there.
I just want to say his performance is very good.
I appreciated the comment of somebody who did not like this movie at all, but Sam Van Halgren, who's the producer of Film Spotting. He made a comment that Ray Fiennes asking Isla to take her finger to her nose is basically the same way he speaks as the Hail Caesar. Say it exactly as I do. Exactly, yeah, exactly the way I say it, precisely. And it's this very calm, very like soothing exactitude that he brings out. And so it's just because he's Ray Fiennes, you're like, oh yeah, I should maybe listen to him, which actually might work against us, right? Because maybe there's these elements we don't know about Kelson. We're going to find out.
Do you know the words memento mori? It means remember death.
Just to go back specifically to the first third of the movie, I want to talk about this as a survival horror briefly, partially because Anton, last year? No, 2 years ago, 2023. Boy, how time flies. When the first season of The Last of Us came out, and you and me in our table talk, we kind of discussed the fact that it skips over some of the things that are so enjoyable about survival horror and are present in even the video games of The Last of Us. And you called it like the Robinson Crusoe aspect of survival, which is lists, and it's, I gotta find supplies, and I have a finite number of bullets, and I have a finite number of this, and the show just kind of skips over. It's like, where are all these bullets? Well, you just find them, and there's a constant threat of these cordyceps and these zombies and these other humans, the butterflies and stuff, all this stuff that's like threatening the characters. So there's lots of things happening. There's lots of danger, but the characters never seem to actually inhabit the world they're in a sense of like basic material need and survival. It doesn't have the survival aspect. And 28 Days Later as a movie is almost entirely survival. It's like, she saves Jim, they go to their like little convenience store and they get the stuff, and then they find Brendan Gleeson and they get more stuff at the grocery store, and then we're going to go here and we're going to get more. It's just like, we just need stuff to keep moving because the surviving is the point. I think Naomi Harris literally says that. It's like, there's no cure, there's no this, there's no that. It's just survival. That's the best you can hope for. This movie, the opening really plays into that in terms of the ritual, especially going out to the mainland. You learn, it's just little world building things, but you see these pictures on the wall. It's like, these are your roles in the community. You can be a fisher, you can be a seamster, you can be a it's like these farmer, you can be these basic things. And then it's like, okay, make sure you have enough arrows. And then they run out of arrows, and it's like, can we fight them out? It's like, we're out of arrows. We don't have any more, so we've lost that ability here, and now we got to think out of a different way. And he's very clear of like, don't waste the arrow shooting them in the knee. You got to get them in the throat or the head, or it's just not worthwhile. And I just appreciate a movie that's finally like, it's so basic because it's a thing in video games, right? But
that's why it's such a
Which is funny that The Last of Us doesn't do
such
that.
a fail for a video game adaptation to not do that. It's
But this does it, where you're like, I can understand the steps and the importance of like, oh, you find something, you use it, and then you move on to the next thing, and you use that.
Well, Garland has said, though, when he was writing 28 Days Later, he was inspired by Resident Evil.
And I can see that in this.
There's
the save points.
At least the first couple of Resident Evil video games are also very slow.
And you'll never have enough bullets to kill the zombies. That's the whole thing in the early games. You have to use your knife sometimes, or you run away.
It's a G.K. Chesterton comment where he says that the best part of Robinson Crusoe is the list of items he's found on the shore. And what that says is that in the mundane, there's actually like imaginative possibilities. And any post-apocalyptic work that's good understands that. The Mad Max movies understand that I just got to get some gas is all we need to build like a world in our mind. And then that's what Miller does on screen. And I think when a survival post-apocalyptic leans into that, like, I don't know, maybe I'm just crazy, but like, as a kid, you have those times where you think about, okay, what would I have to have if I was out, in the woods, or, things where like you just have like your cabin, I'd have to have this, I'd have to have that. Like, there's an enjoyment in that. The TV format nowadays leans into, we just got to show stuff and things are happening, and it won't take the time to ever do that. And so I like that this movie, it reminded me of The Road, where you have at the start, where you had the monotony of like, we got to go into this farm here. It's probably scrounged over. Maybe we can find something. And that's all like the plot point we need here. And we're still like gripped and like, okay, what can we get?
Because there's so much danger. You don't need anything else. That's why it's interesting in a sense that this movie is, it takes zombie movies in a different direction and bringing this mythology and this kind of, elevates, adds the alpha, adds the slow lows, it adds this more dense world building around zombies. But then it also just goes back to basics and does things that basically every zombie thing over beyond the first, season or two of The Walking Dead. Which, to their credit, they were about this. It's like, we got to find a spot to hide out. We need this.
Those are the only 2 seasons I ever watched.
I mean, I think, just digression, I think end of season 4 and early season 5 are like the best the show got. And then it's just kind of, it's never actually bad. The show's never bad. It's just, it gets monotonous. But this seemed, by going back to embracing elements of the saturated zombie horror survival genre, it actually plays better than a lot of zombie media of the past 2 decades since 28 Days Later.
Yeah, I would agree.
Any final thoughts on this movie before we kind of just quickly talk about the originals?
What do you guys think about like the slow lows and this sort of allowing the infected to sort of evolve into different almost subspecies? Because I found it so strange and gross, but like it was something I hadn't seen before that it was also like sort of captivating but disturbing.
We just lived through a pandemic, right, where the amount of variants of a virus shape everything, and it makes sense that a rage virus would have different variants that mutate people in different ways, right? Like, it's just, it makes a lot of sense. I think the introduction to the alphas, frankly, make it enchants the world in a very intriguing way.
That's what I like about them.
And those silhouette shots are awesome.
Oh yeah, with like, him standing on the hill next to the tree.
Well, the way he's standing, again, those images really do evoke the British wild man or green man, the way like the silhouette on the hill and stuff.
There's like, it's almost like images in David Lowery's Green Knight a little bit.
It's interesting that this idea of the alpha, it's something that Zack Snyder in his second zombie movie, what's it called again? Army of the Dead was starting to explore, but never in a satisfactory.
And it's the coolest part of the movie.
But it's not like, it doesn't quite like satisfactory work. But this idea of like what happens if a certain zombie starts to sort of evolve and starts to regain certain instinctual aspects, so that they're not just sort of mindless. But here, I thought the way they work this out, partly by stripping everything down so much, and sort of trying to embed it in kind of like, these are just people who've been forced into the natural state, but in a heightened, aggravated way, right? So literally, the slow lows are basically like, you're not even, you're barely animals now. You're just crawling on the ground, eating worms. But then we get the sort of more animal, predatory, hunter pack dynamics. So the way they did it seems really believable in a way, like, because it just seems like, okay, they're taking patterns you see in sort of the natural world and exploring different concepts of it. But then it also makes kind of a baddie that we can sort of fear in these movies. Apart from, I think we have to maybe, before we wrap up, address the Jimmies. So we get the prologue and we get
Jimmy
the epilogue. And there I was like, my goodness, this is like, your sort of British punk insanity insertion at the end of the movie.
When he does the backflips down with their staffs, and you're like,
all blonde haired. I feel like half the audience was just like,
I do love that Jack O'Connell shows up being like, I'm now the horror bad guy in movies.
I know.
Welcome.
Anton, when I realized it's the guy, because he's in Sinners as well, right? So, but also they're Jimmys, right? Because it's like Jimmy Savile.
It's a cult of Jimmy Savile's.
It's so messed up.
It's meant to be.
Yeah.
And he has the
So
upside down cross because it's the idea of like worshiping the down.
But
yeah.
So it comes back to the very beginning, and so one thing they're also doing, like
There's
a lot
the Rod
of
of Britain, too.
post-apocalyptic films that are good, like the George Miller movies, is you set up different sort of sub-societies as being sort of competing versions of how you might experience things. And so we get the prologue where Jim is like, why have you forsaken me? His father, the priest, or like obsessively embracing sort of the destruction and death aspect of his religion, and then sort of like, so you get that also then has to be set beside Dr. Kelson's version of like how we approach death. So again, like these good post-apocalyptic stories, it's setting up sort of different visions of how you approach this scenario. And then we have to get this kind of like Miller-esque, like crazy gang at the end. And to me, like that moment, maybe I'd say like one of the things I liked the most about this movie, and Anders, you sort of mentioned it to me too. Damn, this movie's bold. Not only are you willing to we're gonna have a bizarro scene of a bleach blonde haired gang jumping around beating up the zombies, but we're also just gonna have naked dudes the entire movie, all hairy, full frontal nudity. And that's just how it is, because that
ripping guys' heads off.
That spines.
That's how we're gonna do it, full on, and it's just gonna be like you wouldn't have the same effect of like these are full on primordial beasts. And I feel like because Boyle, he's won his Oscar and things like that. Like I'm just glad that you're like.
He's never been afraid of full frontal.
Well, no, he has not at all.
Trainspotting, so.
But he can, I feel like he can push it and just be like, we're just doing it this way. Like
I appreciate that Boyle is still Boyle in the editing patterns of the frenetic intercutting,
the music
of the Young Fathers score,
awesome.
Which brings in lyrics and rap and like folk stuff and orchestral movements and Brian Eno style ambient music. It's very British, but it's very British across the totality of the last
all the
century.
Different genres,
it's fascinating. And we got to mention just briefly the cinematography by Anthony Dodd Mantle, which uses iPhone Max 15s to
shoot the whole thing.
Shoot the whole movie, but like you get like these super crisp, beautiful landscape shots, and you get these like wild out of focus like close-ups, and it's interesting how it's taking the kind of the spirit of the original, this lo-fi, let's match it to our moment, the way that we convey this visual sense, but then it actually it's almost like the haunted nature of the landscape and the environments that they're going through is baked into the visual approach, and so it's like the chaos of Britain and the haunted nature is in the imagery.
The lushness and greenness was like amazing at times.
It's actually beautiful. Like, I love the scene where the giant herd of deer go by.
Yeah.
And you're
It's
kind of
super cool.
struck by how like enormous this herd of deer is. And you're like, you would never get that in Britain today. But it's
Well,
just
no, because
kind of
humans
beauty.
like regularly hunt deer.
It's a
and
it's
keep
a
them
movie
small.
where you have to give a lot of credit to like the scouting of like the landscapes and like how you get that. 'Cause-
I'm super curious to see what we get with the Bone Temple when it comes out in January. So Garland wrote it. Boyle did not direct it. It's directed by Nia DaCosta, who did. She did the Marvels movie, whatever she did, a Marvel paycheck film. But before that, she did the Candyman remake or requel, which is not a great script, but is actually visually kind of and odd, like sonically. Like I love the score in the movie, kind of fascinating. So I'm curious what she does with this under Boyle's steady producerial like hand, and then Garland's story continuing through. Because
Did Garland is he writing all the screenplay?
all three, yes. And then Boyle will direct the final one. That's the idea here. I don't want to say that this movie is a classic in terms of horror now, because it's kind of like the way it's structurally set up and just the nature of having a sequel that clearly is going to pick up right where this leaves off. It's going to retroactively change the way a bit of this movie plays. And so I'm going to let it at the time, but I am very happy to see that Boyle and Garland come into this genre again and kind of make a very bold impact where I'm pretty confident being like, this is a very good horror movie, very good survival film, and like very entertaining. Really glad that they came back to this well.
This is a glorious day. A day of judgment. My children!
So before we wrap up the conversation, I don't want to go particularly in depth on the previous films, but I am curious, did you revisit 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later in advance of this movie? And just like, what's your sum up of that movie if you did? Or if you didn't, what do you remember of that film, and like kind of what are your basic thoughts on it? So Anton, obviously you reviewed 28 Days Later, so what's your take 23 years
So
out?
I went back in my film journal, which goes back to 2005, and I did not see 28 Days Later in there, so I haven't seen it for like 20 years. When I rewatched it, I was like, wow, this holds up way better than I expected it to. Because to be perfectly honest, like, as much as the early images of Empty London have always sort of hung around in my mind, it's not a movie I had often thought about and been like, oh yeah, I really love 28 Days Later. I just was like, oh yeah, it was, Danny Boyle kickstarting zombies again. But going back to it, I was like, no, this is a classic.
I would agree. I revisited. I liked it quite a bit when I saw. I did not see it in the initial run. I was too young. Like, it was too scary. I wasn't a horror movie guy. I watched it finally in high school, and I really liked it. But I have to say I was almost as fascinated by the DIY element of the filmmaking as I was by the story. Now, retroactively, I see all the Garland stuff in there. I see the Boyle things. I see how much it influenced the horror genre. But I also just think at its core, it's like a really compelling, very gripping and realistic survival scenario. Mm-hmm. And Cillian Murphy, it's kind of a bit of an early Cillian Murphy star-making turn.
It is. Well, before
kinda,
that, he'd just mostly done British stuff in TV roles.
So it's sweet to watch it in that respect, but I'm now like, oh yeah, this is firmly one of those like great horror movies. And
I hadn't watched it in a good at least 15 years, maybe 20 years. And like I liked it when it came out in theater, and I bought the DVD and I watched it a few times, but it held up better than I thought it would. And I was really struck though by the cinematography, which at the time seemed like that like pre 4K digital video. It's like, I think what is it, a Canon X1 that they shoot it on.
I own that camera.
Yeah. And but now the things that at the time seemed like technical limitations are kind of like artistic, and I kind of like the low, it's grainy, it's kind of like blown out, the digital look. I like it.
It doesn't seem like a gimmick anymore. That's the weird thing.
Exactly.
It
feels like an artistic choice.
Yes. What about 28 Weeks Later? Did you
revisit
it?
I did not revisit it. I think I only ever saw it once in theater. I just vaguely remember that Jeremy Renner is in it.
Yes.
And I remember he's a soldier as well, right? A sniper in it.
He's always
as well.
Jeremy Renner is like, how often is this guy a sniper in movies?
Even Hawkeye's essentially it's not.
Exactly.
Wind River.
Yeah.
There's got to be a few more. But, like, he's...
Hurt Locker.
It's just...
Well, he's not a sniper in Hurt Locker, but he's a soldier.
No, but he's still a soldier with the rifle. I rewatched 28 Weeks Later the night before seeing this film, and I was a really big fan of it in 2007. I think I was really drawn into the kind of nuts and bolts of this idea of like an occupation of an infected island, right? The military aspects, and I remember really, really liking the night vision aspects of the later scenes and how creepy they were. I do think they're still pretty effective nowadays. That being said, the thing that was burned in my brain was just the opening of Robert Carlyle abandoning his wife and running, and revisiting the movie. I'm like, that's why this movie is still good, but that's kind of the high point, and it's the first 10 minutes of the movie, and then the rest of it is like totally fine as a zombie movie, as a horror movie. But now that I've seen so much more within the horror genre, and even you take 2007 in terms of innovations within night vision, within what we're doing within like military or contemporary commentary within horror, something like Wreck I find like way better than something like this. And so it's lost a bit of its novelty in terms of thematic implication, and it's now just like it plays pretty well, but it's not 28 Days Later, and it's not 28 Years Later.
It's gonna look even more weird because I rewatched it. I reviewed it for the site. 28 Weeks Later is gonna look even more weird and sort of just okay because of 28 Years Later. Because now you like if they had just sort of continued the sort of rage virus world with different directors and everyone doing their different thing, it'd be one thing. But now it just sort of looks like this insertion between, the Boyle movies. I was intrigued watching it, like how much the movie is a reflection of sort of the War on Terror, Iraq War movie, urban combat, all these sorts of things, occupation force. But how in some ways that like recedes back, and it's interesting in retrospect seeing it's sort of as a forward commentary, then also on sort of politics of how you control infection when we came into sort of the COVID world. So it's a movie that like it's more trying to be more topical, unlike 28 Years Later, but that desire to be topical actually makes it more dated.
Yes. It seems very much of that late 2000s, early 2010s era, where I feel like in terms of zombie storytelling or just Hollywood storytelling, that and something like World War Z very much seem of the same period. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I was going to mention that film, the World War Z.
And 28 Days Later seems now free of its context. It's now just like part of cinema. And 28 Years Later is so strange, it doesn't really play into the discourse of this moment, and I kind of appreciate it for that.
How did you know? I mean, how did you know he was infected?
The blood.
Yeah, but there was blood everywhere. It was on me. It was on you.
I didn't know he was infected, okay? He knew. I could see it in his face. Look, if someone gets infected, you've got between 10 and 20 seconds to kill them. It might be your brother or your sister or your oldest friend. It makes no difference. And just so you know where you stand, if it happens to you, I'll do it in a heartbeat. He was full of plans. Have you got any plans, Jim? Do you want us to find a cure and save the world, or just fall in love and Plans are pointless. Staying alive's as good as it gets.
I'm pretty confident this is going to be one of the more intriguing major Hollywood movies that we see this year. If you see it, definitely let us know your thoughts. Maybe you hate it. Honestly, it's a film that makes very bold choices. So maybe you do not like the alphas. Maybe you do not like the baby thing. Maybe you think Ray Fiennes is just weird as hell when he shows up. Let us know, and thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Three Brothers Filmcast.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.